There is a lot of conversation around God's will. Everyone you meet is either waiting for God's will, doing God's will, or expecting something strange when it concerns God's will, one way or the other. Upon the lips of every man is God's will. However, God's will doesn't always come that way. Sometimes the arrival of God's will is always anti the will of man. Some other times, the arrival of God's will meets expectations, especially for one whose heart has been trained to receive all that God prepares. In some other instances, the arrival of God's will is late, based on human calculation of time. God is not governed by time. However, he ensured that man is ruled by time. So he is not underneath the earth, he is above it. So he made summer, winter, harvest, seed, time. As long as the earth remaineth, seed, time, harvest shall not cease. He said, for there's time for everything under the sun. He is not underneath it, he's above it. So he's not limited by time. He rules over time. He set time and he stepped out of time to rule over time. And so sometimes the arrival of time, or of the will of God, I beg your pardon, can be termed, late, based on the perspective of mankind on timing. Even gets worse when you see scriptures that says that a day with God is like 1,000 years on earth. So if you're waiting for the will of God, sometimes can be discouraging. But you see, in not waiting for the will of the Lord, a man is then led to do his own desires. For us to birth perfect will on earth, man's will must align to God's will. Once a man's will is in sync with God's will, he births perfect will. Everyone around him would say that he's smart. But the interesting thing is that it's not about being smart, it's simply about plugging in. Many people do not always recognize that window of opportunity that makes them look like a genius before other people, or before other mankind, before other men. That window of opportunity is simply in God's will. I said this once, God does not reward activity. He simply rewards men who are in his will. Someone would say, sir, are you saying that I don't get reward for doing what I do? You would, because it's a natural principle, you sow, you reap. However, when you talk about the reward of the Lord, you're talking about something weightier than money can pay for. In not waiting for God's will, you most likely will birth Ishmael. And when Ishmael is birthed, Ishmael will be a trouble or problem to Isaac. What you create outside of God's will always haunt that God's will, or be a threat to the will of God that you eventually birth when you birth it, if you ever get to birth it. Because sometimes you can be so overwhelmed, except you are shown mercy. You can be so overwhelmed with that which you birth by the flesh that you do not remember that there's a will. Some other times the devil can help you such that what you birth by the will of flesh is so soothing, so amazing, that you need nobody stressing you. I mean, it's like you're home, this comfort. All you ever prayed for, all you ever dreamed about is in this. You just worked He just did something and you got it. But you know in the heart of your heart that this isn't the best of God for me. This is not God's will. The devil can hide and ensure that you succeed at it. The devil does not always have to allow you fail, especially when he knows that your success implies that you would be so taken away from doing the will of God. Certain victories are distractions. Distractions from focusing on the main goal, the main assignment. And it takes a man who is thoroughly invested in the will of the Lord to stay in God's will. So we get invested in the will of God to do God's will. That is to say, you get invested in His words to be able to do His words. A man is going to find it difficult to do what he has not heard, what he has not seen, what his heart has not come to agree with. It's easier for your hearts to come to agreement with something you can see, something you have heard, something, that has been communicated with you. It's easier for your heart to come into sync with that. So as I said, in not waiting for God's will, you birth an Ishmael. And each time a man is not working in God's will, he's left with common sense. There is a limitation to common sense. There is a limit to what you can achieve in your common sense. And so if you want to rely on that, you'll always discover that you're flawed. In the absence of divine guidance, many people resort into, common sense and practical tool for decision making, or bank on experience. However, it's important that we note, that from individual to individual, culture to culture, depending on your knowledge bank, common sense really varies. In fact, if you want to stay on common sense actually is not common, because you will discover that when you interact with certain people, not necessarily believers or Christians or, when you interact with people, you discover that which you felt was foundational and basic, everyone has it. But in the long run, you discover that common sense is not actually common. And now, if common sense is not actually common with certain people, and yet they want to bank on a flawed, state, it means their results will never resonate. It will never go beyond the time where they are, never go beyond that generation. To truly build something worth emulation is to build it in God's will. God's will naturally outlive you. You see, when you have a reliance on personal judgment, as against God's judgment or God's will for you, you'll be subjecting yourself to moral ambiguity and some measures of uncertainty. Yeah, many folks around you will tell you that what you said is sensible, your actions are sensible. That's the most sensible thing to do. However, that is most sensible thing to do does not mean that it's the best of options to do or best of options to get results. Earlier on, I used a phrase that in not waiting for the will of the Lord, you birth Ishmael. I remember that story. It's a story of Sarah saying to her husband Isaac that I know God said to us that we're going to have a child. Maybe the way to fulfill that is to go through, this my maid. That you have a maid does not mean that it's made for you to fulfill the promise. Not all maids are made. Some maids are actually made to bring you down, to deviate your attention, to shift your focus. And so they had this maid, and this maid, Abraham was made to, sleep with his maid, thinking that it was going to birth the will of the Lord. And each time a man is not waiting or patient enough to embrace the will of the Lord, flesh is involved, and there are limitations, consequences of banking on flesh. And so it takes a man who is spiritually connected, okay, to effectively navigate life and navigate its complexities, especially when it touches human wisdom. In this, I'm simply saying that human wisdom lacks depth. You can be well read and yet very ignorant. And that's because the highest form of wisdom of mankind is still foolishness before the Lord or before the creator of the universe. So we must understand that the tension between spiritual insight and human reasoning still exists. So how do we stay in the will of God? One of the ways to stay in the will of the Lord is to know his word. Another way is to know him himself, because his reputation will help you trust him through. It's not enough to know him. It's not enough to know his word. The idea of knowing his word is to see a reflection of him, because a man is not separated from his word. His word is a reflection, ought to be a reflection of his person. But most times we've seen people who churn out words, who just say things and they want to dissociate themselves from more things that they've said. Meanwhile, your word should be your bond. A man who knows this, when I say believer, for instance, the believer should know he doesn't need to sign a bond. He naturally knows that his word is his bond. That's what it means to be a Christ-like. That's what it means to be a believer. And so, staying in God's will always pays. At everything we do, every decision, we're at crossroad at certain point where we want to decide, are we staying in the will of God or are we going to do our will? We always have that decision to make. In the face of those decisions, I'm simply encouraging you today that it pays to stay in God's will. Stay in God's will. Your life is made better by staying in God's will. Again, this is PV Masons, and I'm excited to come your way again today. It's a short charge, but stay in God's will. God's will ensures that all things are truly beautiful in His time. Outside of His time, nothing is beautiful. Have a great one. God has blessed you.